Hey, welcome back. This is Mr. Shanahan with Magnet Sociology, and today's topic is Chapter 10, Racial and Ethnic Relationships. We're going to start out with our class study and talk about a class divided. Then we're going to go on to Section 1, Race, Ethnicity, and Social Structure. And then we'll go on to Section 2, Patterns of Intergroup Relations. And then finally, we'll go to Section 3, Minority Groups in the United States. In 1968, third grade teacher Jane Elliott divided her students into groups of brown-eyed and blue-eyed children. She told the class that the brown-eyed children were superior to the blue-eyed children and they would receive special treatment. The two groups of children internalized these rules of blue-eyed children, appeared to be miserable and defeated. The experiment was one way to help children understand the effects of discrimination. Jane Elliott did this case study when she was inspired after the assassination of Martin Luther King, and she decided to teach her students the importance of discrimination or the role it plays in our society. And as you can see from the picture, all of these children were white. And so it was difficult for her to explain discrimination to them and use the eye color as the deciding factor on whether you'd be discriminated against. As a result, what she did was she had them wear collars indicating their social status and things like that. And it was a very effective training. And there's many very good videos on YouTube about this case study. Section 1, Race, Ethnicity, and Social Structure. Like other scientists and social scientists, sociologists reject the idea that races are biologically distinct. Ethnicity is the social category based on a set of cultural characteristics, not physical traits. Sociologists acknowledge that a society's dominant groups enjoy a position of power and privilege in comparison to minority groups or groups who are singled out and treated unequally. Race, ethnicity, and minority groups are important factors that shape the social structure of the United States. The United States is largely built on race. To what extent is race both a myth and a reality? Which cultural characteristics help define ethnicity, and what is a minority group? So all these are questions you should be able to answer by the completion of this lesson. Race as a myth. Many people think that humankind can be sorted into biologically distinct groups called races. This idea suggests that there are pure examples of different races and that any person can belong to only one race. Biologists and geneticists and social scientists all reject this view. All people belong to the human species. There are greater differences within racial groups than between racial groups. So what this is saying is that it doesn't matter if you're from Sweden or Nigeria, all humans are biologically the same. There's just different rates of skin tone. Race is a reality. Racial differences become important because people believe them to be. Race is a social context. In sociological terms, race is a category of people who share observable physical characteristics and whom others see as being a distinct group, such as white people versus black people. This is a cover from 1993 special edition of Time magazine. It featured a computer-generated image of a woman's face to represent what a multiracial United States might look like. Time's New Eve blended features from 6 different racial and ethnic groups to create this image. Why do scholars argue that race is a myth? There's far more genetic variation between people within a racial category than there is outside of its racial category. So our differences are external, not internal. Race in the United States Census. What can U.S. Census classification tell us about changing views of race in the United States? If you conduct a library or internet research to find the racial classification of the U.S. Census across time, use the one census from the 1800s, one from the 1900s, as well as the classification used in the 2000 or today's 2020 census. Create a 3-column table comparing the racial categories. From each census form, record the census data for each year in a separate column. Be sure to record the correct census year in the top row of each column. Look at the image of the woman on Time magazine cover on the previous page. Based on the physical appearance, how would you identify her race on each census? Circle your response for each year. How would you categorize yourself? Underline your responses for each census year. Before 1960, the census takers was responsible for identifying the race of each person taking the census. What do you think the census taker based their classifications on? Do you find it easy or difficult to categorize the woman from the Time magazine cover? Why do you think these categories have changed over time? What factors might cause the categories to change in the next 50 years? Ethnicity. Ethnicity is the set of cultural characteristics that distinguish one group from another group. People who share a common cultural background and a common sense of identity are known as an ethnic group. Ethnicity is based on the characteristics such as national origin, religion, language, customs, and values. So your ethnicity could be Irish, could be Italian, it could be Chinese, or it could be Indian. Ethnic groups must pass cultural beliefs and practices from generation to generation. Ethnic identity can cross racial or national boundaries. Ethnicity is based on cultural traits, while race is based on physical traits. So your ethnic group might be from your cultural beliefs, such as being Jewish, or it could be based on your identity, might cross national boundaries, such as African American or Irish. You know, ethnicity is based on cultural traits, while race is based on physical traits. These cultural traits might be, like Hispanic. How does ethnicity differ from race? Ethnicity refers to cultural characteristics, while race refers to physical characteristics. So your ethnicity, you could be Hispanic, but your cultural characteristics, where race might be your physical characteristics. So you might be a Black Hispanic, or African American Hispanic kind of person, that kind of thing. Although no particular physical feature or ethnic background is superior or inferior to any others, many sociologists recognize that people may place an arbitrary value on specific characteristics. A minority group. A minority group is a group of people who, because of their physical characteristics or cultural practices, are singled out and treated unequally. In this sense, the term minority has nothing to do with group size, but with unequal standing in society in relation to the dominant group. In the United States, white males are considered the dominant group, so white women are still considered a minority, even though they are larger because they have less cultural influence. The dominant group is the group that possesses the ability to discriminate by virtue of its greater power and privilege and social status in society. Here again, in the United States, the dominant group is white people of Northern European ancestry. So what makes a minority group less powerful in society than the main dominant group? Its unequal standing in society in relation to the dominant group. Dominant group retains greater power, privilege, and status, which allows to continue to discriminate against the minority group. Section 2. Patterns of intergroup relations. Discrimination and prejudice are common features of the minority group experience worldwide. Discrimination can occur at a societal level as legal discrimination and institutional discrimination, and at an individual level. Prejudice is supported by the use of stereotypes, simplified, exaggerated, and unfavorable generations about groups of people. Sociologists draw on sociological, psychological, and economic explanations to identify the source of racism. The most common patterns of minority group treatment exist along the continuum that ranges from cultural pluralism to assimilation, legal protection, segregation, subjugation, population transfer, and extermination. Understanding the concepts and causes of discrimination and prejudice are the key to understanding major patterns of minority group treatment. So your reading focus for this unit, or this section, is how do discrimination and prejudice differ? Which approaches do sociologists use to explain the sources of discrimination and prejudice? And what are the common patterns of minority group treatment? So what does inequality feel like? Here you see pictures of people who experienced segregation. Elizabeth Eckford, followed by an angry mob, makes her way into an integrated high school in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. Here, two men drink from segregated water fountains. Okay, so they're getting water from the same water source, but they have to have different fountains. And Rosa Parks sits on the 1956 bus in Birmingham, Alabama, 1 year after she refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. Okay, so then this led to the famous bus boycott and things like that. All right, discrimination and prejudice. The inequality experienced by minority groups are common across the globe. Discrimination is the denial of equal treatment to individuals based on their group membership. It can occur on an individual level or a societal level. Legal discrimination upheld by law does take place. Institutionalized discrimination is the outgrowth of the structure of society. So even if it's an institutionalized discrimination is when the practice is so embedded into our society, even when it's not legal, we're still doing it. Prejudice is an unsupported generalization about a category of people. Stereotype is an oversimplified, exaggerated, or unfavorable generalization about a group. Self-fulfilling prophecy is the prediction resulting in a behavior that fulfills that prophecy. And racism is the belief that one's own race is superior. So how is discrimination related to prejudice? Prejudice involves attitudes, unsupported generalizations about a group, while discrimination involves denial of equal treatment based upon prejudices. Merton's pattern of prejudice. Robert Merton argued that prejudice and discrimination are related but do not always go hand in hand. According to Merton, people could combine discrimination and prejudice in 4 possible ways. There's the active bigot. The active bigot is prejudiced and openly discriminatory. The timid bigot is prejudiced but is afraid to discriminate because of societal pressure. The fair weather liberal is not prejudiced but discriminates anyway because of societal pressure. And the all weather liberal is not prejudiced and does not discriminate. Sociological explanations of prejudice. Prejudices are embedded into our social norms. Our psychological explanation is that prejudiced people have an authoritarian personality type. Prejudice may be the result of frustration and anger. Scapegoating occurs when an innocent person or group is blamed for one's trouble. A scapegoat it is an old tradition of what they used to do is they would take a goat and they would put all the problems of society on the goat, and then they would slaughter the goat as a sacrifice in hopes of alleviating the social pressure. And so this is where the expression scapegoating comes from. It's an old ancient practice. So we use this term to explain how we are trying to explain society's problems by scapegoating others. Economic explanations is prejudice arises out of competition for resources. The dominant group may encourage competition between minority groups in order to maintain its dominant status. So what are the key points of the 3 explanations of the sources of discrimination and prejudice? The possible answer is sociological prejudice arises out of the desire to be part of a group. Psychological prejudices arise from anger and frustration. Economic prejudice arise out of competition for scarce resources. Cultural pluralism is a policy that allows each group within society to keep its unique cultural idea. Switzerland is an example with 3 official languages: French, Italian, and German. Assimilation is the blending of culturally distinct groups into a single group with a common culture and identity. The idea, the American melting pot, is this assimilation idea, and which in recent years, with all the influence of cultural diversity and that sort of thing, has caught a lot of flack that we're not the melting pot we once were. It can happen informally, which is, just people kind of become American, or it could be by force, where we used to require people to learn English and things like that, and to force them to assimilate into our society. We don't do that so much anymore. Legal protection. The rights of minorities are protected by law. The United States is an example. It includes affirmative action laws. Affirmative action laws try to give the advantage to people who have historically been discriminated against, to try to give them the opportunity to rise up from the discriminatory practices of the past. Segregation is a policy that physically separates a minority group from the dominant group. De jure segregation is based on law. De facto segregation is based on custom and informal norms. So back in the pre-1950s, when discrimination was, or Jim Crow South, the segregation, there was all kinds of laws that prevented white people and black people from mixing together, or minorities. And so this prevented things, and that would be known as de jure segregation. De facto segregation is the practice that took place after the 1950s, where it was no longer in the Civil Rights Act, where it was no longer legal to segregate, but people still tended to do it because it was what they had grown accustomed to. And so there would oftentimes be discrimination as a result of that. Subjugation is a practice whereby dominance is maintained by force. The most extreme form of subjugation is slavery. In the prior to 1994, there was South Africa's system of apartheid, in which they formally segregated against their society, keeping black people in a subservient role. This also existed here in the United States in the Jim Crow era. And of course, slavery existed prior to the American Civil War. Population transfer is a separation of groups by transferring the minority population to a new territory. Indirect transfer occurs when the dominant group makes the life of minorities so miserable that they leave. Direct transfer involves using force to move people to new locations. So this indirect transfer was common in Russia, where the Jews were treated with such severity in a practice known as pogroms, where they would go around and beat Jewish people, burn their homes, and destroy their businesses and things like that, oftentimes forcing them to leave. Nazi Germany did similar things like this before they started their Holocaust programs. But those people would leave in an effort to escape the persecution and come here to the United States. Here in the United States, we did it to the Native American population, most notably the Cherokee people in Georgia, where they were essentially forced to move by a direct transfer of power, and where the Native Americans were forced to move out of Georgia and the rest of most of the southern eastern United States in order to give white people access to the land that was controlled by the Native Americans. Extermination is the most extreme goal, is elimination. Genocide is the goal and complete destruction of a minority group. The most famous case of this is the Holocaust, which took place in Europe during the Second World War, where the Nazis of Germany tried to eliminate all people of Jewish and Slavic descent. In Rwanda, there was the conflict between the racial groups there, and in Rwanda, they were able to stop the genocide there, but it did take place. There's also been genocidal practices in Armenia and other parts of the world. Ethnic cleansing is the combination of extermination of transferal. Common or most recent episodes of ethnic cleansing have taken place in Serbia and in the Sudan. So those are more recent examples in history in those two places. So the patterns of intergroup relations can be seen in a continuum of behavior and treatment that ranges from acceptance to rejection. Cultural pluralism is ethnic, religious, and racial variety that's encouraged. The example is in Switzerland and the Netherlands and other parts of Europe, in the United States. Assimilation is culturally distinct groups blend into a single group with a common culture. And the most common example of this is the United States, because we're famous for our assimilating and into the melting pot or tossed salad approach to American society. Legal protection is the minority rights are protected by law. In the United States, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, protected those rights. Subjugation is the dominant group controls every aspect of a minority group's life through force. And Jim Crow South was an example, as was South Africa during the time of apartheid. Segregation is the minority group is physically separated from the dominant group. Here again, the Jim Crow South that took place, and actually there was segregation in northern states as well. It's just that it wasn't as codified as it was in the South. Population transfer is a dominant group moves a minority group to a new location within or outside of the country. The example here of this population transfer, of course, the most famous is the Trail of Tears, in which the Native Americans were forced to live on reservations west of the Mississippi River, even though they were East Coast people. Extermination, of course, the most famous example is the Holocaust, where the Jews were eliminated by the Germans. The dominant group attempts to destroy the minority group and in an effort to cleanse their society. So what features of cultural pluralism do you think are missing in society where extermination occurs? You might think that ethnic, religious, and racial diversity may be lacking, or at least an understanding. All right, section 3. Minority groups in the United States. Minority groups in the United States have achieved varying levels of social and economic success. The major minority groups in the United States include African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. Other minority groups in the United States include white ethnics and Arab Americans. So the main idea for this section is that the United States is home to a remarkable number of diverse minority groups, each with its own distinctive history and challenges. So what we want to focus on in this section is, what is the American dilemma? How did the civil rights movement affect African Americans? And what major challenges face Hispanics? Why have Asian Americans been called the model minority? And how have government policies affected Native Americans? What unique problems do other minorities face? So how long does it take to reach the American dream? In 1944, a Swedish sociologist described the conflict between the races in the United States. He noted a gap between Americans claimed to believe and how they actually behave. Americans have not always lived up to the ideals of freedom and equality when dealing with minority groups, and the conflict dates back to colonial times. Minority groups have prospered in relation to how closely they adapt to the white Anglo-Protestant or the WASP ideal. So how does the American dilemma affect minorities? Those who adapt to the WASP's image are accepted to the mainstream America more easily. Others have a difficult time. So what we find is those groups that adapt to the way white people want are the ones that tend to be more successful. So using this county data from the last census, these maps show the distribution of the 4 major minority groups in the United States. 4 major minority groups are African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. What do these maps suggest about the regional patterns of the ethnic groups and their influence on the country? 12% of the population are African Americans. They experiences historically shaped by slavery, discrimination, and segregation. One of the big things that students tend to complain about is that whenever they talk about African American history, they're talking about slavery or discrimination. Okay, but these are the major factors that have influenced African American uh, way of life in America. So the civil rights movement brought significant gains towards the African American rights and equality. Some negative trends in education, employment, income all reveal continuing inequality for African Americans. Since 1965, the number of black representatives in the government has grown quickly. Organizations such as the National Urban League work to empower African Americans, and group faces environmental racism or racial bias in environmental policies and practices. Historically, African Americans have used a number of strategies in the struggle of equality, ranging from moving in search of opportunity to founding African American colleges and educational institutions. So, what challenges face African Americans today? Equal access to health care, educational opportunities, treatment in the criminal justice system, and of course, environmental racism. The largest minority group is Hispanics. They have surpassed the African American population as percentage of the American population. They trace their heritage to Spain or Spanish-speaking Latin American countries. Population of Hispanics is growing faster than the general population. During the 1960s, Hispanics in the United States were mostly from Mexico, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Central and South American immigrants are now common in the United States. They came to the United States to seek political freedom and economic opportunity in many cases. Estimated in 2006, more than 11 million illegal immigrants lived in the United States. A vast majority of these were Hispanics. Hispanics now hold more than 6,000 appointed and elected positions in the United States. The poverty rate, however, is double that of white Americans. Hispanics come from a variety of national backgrounds. In recent years, their growing numbers have led to increased political power. So why are Hispanics becoming more politically powerful? Because the number of Hispanic voters increases as the Hispanic population increases, making this bloc desirable for politicians. Asian Americans. Earliest to arrive were Chinese and Japanese. The immigrants from most of Asian countries now here, including the Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Pakistan. Projected to be 8% of the population by 2050. They have used education to move up the economic ladder. The median income for Asian Americans is higher than for other minority groups. Some call Asians the model minority because they're quick assimilation. Many resent this label because it ignores the struggles of historically faced. Asian Americans tend to try to blend in more so, even giving up their given names to adopt more anglicized names in order to be able to fit into society, the American society, easier. Asian Americans face higher rates of stress, depression, mental illness, and suicide. The diversity of Asian American communities has influenced American society. In many cities, celebrations like Chinese New Year, Parade Below have become widely attended events. So why do Asian Americans reject the label model minority? Asian Americans resent being labeled as a single group. As you can see from the previous chart, they're from all over Asia. Asian Americans are from many countries and have distinct cultures. Different groups experience different forms of prejudice or acceptance, and so they too have had to struggle, and model implies that they are somehow not legitimate. Original inhabitants of the United States. United States are the Native Americans. There are 2.9 million Native Americans in the United States. They have historically suffered from disease, warfare, destruction of their traditional ways of life. They've reduced their numbers dramatically. The U.S. government took traditional lands and forced Native American people onto what are known as reservations for their place to live, taking their land away, forcing them to change their way of life. Policies encouraged assimilation into white culture. In fact, at one point in history, they were forced to send their children to boarding schools where they would learn white ways. Statistics reveal dire challenges for the Native American population. 55% live on reservations still today. Pan-Indianism is a social and political movement that united culturally distinct Native American nations to work together on issues that affect all Native Americans. The inability of Native Americans to work as one cohesive group is one of the reasons that the United States was so easily able to subdue them, because they were splintered into so many small groups. At the National Powwow, Native Americans from across the country celebrate their cultures with music, dance, and educational programs. So how might pan-Indianism enable Native Americans to address economic and social challenges? By uniting culturally distinct tribes to work together for legislative and economic challenges that will benefit all. So the pan-Indianism would allow these Native American nations of many different types to work together, sort of as a United States of Native America, and to improve their standard with the United States. Other minorities. There are white ethnic groups within the United States that are considered minorities. They are mainly from Catholic countries such as Ireland, Italy, France, Poland, and Greece. They all face discrimination by the white Protestants, which were the dominant people who founded the early colonies of the United States. Jewish Americans are another minority group within the United States. They focus their ethnic identity on their faith, and they have historically faced anti-Semitism, which is discrimination against prejudice against Jews. Historically, they've experienced it everywhere they've gone. You see it in Europe, and you see it in the Middle East. You see it to some extent in Africa. You see it in here in the United States. So Jewish people have had it pretty rough just because of anti-Semitism. Arab Americans, there's 3.5 million Arab Americans. Arab Americans face new discrimination after the Arab-led terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Most Arab Americans tend to be Islamic, but not all. And yet most folks that have Arabic names come from Arabic countries are treated in a discriminatory fashion. So what challenges have faced other minorities in the United States? Assimilating into a foreign society, they have to learn to speak English. They have, oftentimes there's open discrimination and hate crimes. And you'll see that very often towards both Jews and Islamic communities. Being an American after the 9/11 attacks, within hours of the terrorist attacks on September 11th, Arab American communities and individuals were faced with violent attacks and other discrimination. These acts revealed that non-Arab Americans knew very little about Arab Americans. The Detroit Arab American Study asked Arab Americans how September 11th had changed their lives. Researchers completed face-to-face interviews with 1,016 Arab Americans and Iraqi Christians and 508 members of the general population. 15% had experienced discrimination, such as verbal insults being the most common. 3% reported acts of violence against them or their family. Many Arab Americans have united to educate their fellow citizens about the Arab American culture and to dispel stereotypes of Arab Americans as terrorists. On January 23rd of 2007, vandals defaced a mosque in the Islamic Center of America, which is Dearborn, Michigan. So which of the study's findings do you find most interesting? How do you think the study's findings could be used to fight stereotypes or misinformation? All right, so now what we're going to do is a lab. In this, I want you to decide who Americans are. And so who are the Americans and how do we get here? So the introduction: in this lab, you'll study the concepts of race, ethnicity in the United States. Work in small groups to research the history of the assigned ethnic and racial group. Create a display to show the history of your group. Illustrating your timeline, illustrate major dates, groups of people, and events in the immigration history of your assigned group. Use drawings, photographs, and maps. Choose one group from the timeline and create a poster that shows this group's arrival in the United States. What factors brought them here? How has your group changed the American culture? Choose 4 of the areas below to include on your poster: art, music, food, language, politics, science, religion. Then you'll present your exhibit, display your timeline and posters for the class, present your work to the class, and make sure each person in your group has part of the presentation. So, at the end, we'll discuss what did you learn from this lab. As a group, discuss the following: what are some of the similarities and differences among immigration history? What push and pull factors do you see at work? Do you know about cultural contributions of different groups? And do you know where your ancestors arrived from? That'll be all for today, and I hope you appreciated this. All right. Have a good day.